This is part 6 in a series of videos I'm posting on the repair and restoration of a Mini 803 vintage computer. So far I've repaired all the individual parts. So I've repaired the power supply, the main board, the case, straightened out some metalwork, and I've just finished refurbishing the 2 disk drives. So I'm now ready to start to reassemble the entire computer and see if it finally works when it's in one piece. I thought I'd start by showing the final assembly of the floppy drive. There are 2 of these in the machine. I've taken this apart, cleaned it. I took the 2 side cheeks off, gave those a good clean. I didn't take the heads out in the end. It was fairly easy just to get the rods out and give those a good clean, and it's now totally free. I've given the heads a good clean. All the rest of it is fine, so I'll get this reassembled and then we'll move on to refitting these to the mounting plate and then get the mounting plate fitted back into the main part of the case. So first step in doing this is to refit the shield. So just make sure you don't catch any wires when you're doing this. There's little wires running everywhere, and this just clips into place over the top of the heads. Okay, and it's fitting the circuit board. So I've cleaned this, done some basic testing on it. There are no shorts, all the caps seem fine. Given the connectors a bit of a clean, and it all looks to be in perfect order. I've lubricated the rails, by the way, with some silicone grease, so everything runs nice and freely. So this fits in a little slot. And then before I screw it into final position, I'll just reattach the cables. That's the first one. These are numbered, by the way, so again, what I normally do is take a photograph before I take it apart and make sure I get the cables in the right positions while I put them back on. And then I'll compare this against the photograph before I put the drive back into the machine. This then slides all the way in. Couple of mounting screws. Make sure you use the screws here that have the insulated washer underneath the head. Then it's time for the front cover. So reconnect the LED. Put the mounting screws in, and then do the same on the other side. Okay, that's that done. Looking on the underside, this is the belt I was talking about in the previous video there. I'm not quite sure what they're made of, but they do seem to last pretty much forever. For anyone that's interested, this is the model number 52. Not quite sure how useful that would be, but okay, so that's one drive. I'll do the same with the other one, and then we'll fit these back to the base plate. Okay, so that's both floppy drives reassembled. I've adjusted the catches to make sure they work as they're supposed to. This is what I meant about these popping up with a bit of force, and that's what causes these to eventually snap off. So as you can see, I've tidied up the buttons, made the whole thing look nice again, adjusted the catches, and that's as far as I can go with these without doing any actual software reading, or at least doing some data reading from a 5 1/4 inch disc. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is get these mounted onto the base plate, but before I can do that I need to straighten the base plate out. So if we compare the plate against the front panel, so this front panel is flat. If I put it on the bench, you can see it's got a straight edge. If I now compare that with the panel, you can see that it's got a distinct bend to it. It's only a few millimeters, but even so it needs straightening out before I put it back into the machine. So I'll just quickly pop into the workshop with this and get it straightened out, and then get the floppy drives reattached to it. Okay, so a couple of minutes in the workshop, and this is now as straight as it's going to get. It's within 0.5 millimetre, so that should be fine. Now with the PCB mounting attachments, some were bent, which I've straightened out, but one was completely broken, so I've replaced that with a screw and bolt type arrangement. It is insulated, the bolt doesn't go all the way through, and if this was my machine I'd replace all 6 with these. But at any rate, I'll do just this one as the repair, and it's beneficial to have at least one screw down attachment point anyway. It makes it far more secure, and it's less likely the board will drop off if the machine's moved about aggressively. Okay, so I'll get the floppy drives provisionally bolted to this. Now they will need adjusting once they're back into the machine. That's what these slots are for. It allows you to move the drives back and forward to make them align with the front panel. And these don't poke through the front panel, they actually sit behind it, and so it's important that they are fairly accurately adjusted so that they come right up against the back panel, because obviously a gap would look fairly unsightly. Okay, so I'll get these provisionally dropped in, and then the next step will be to put the power supply back onto here, put the power supply cover on, and then this entire unit will be ready to go back into the machine. So that's both floppy disks refitted to the plate. I've put the cover plate on as well, and I've also mounted the power supply bracket. So these are all now bolted down. I've left the screws that adjust the floppy drives fairly loose. We can access those from the bottom, because when we adjust the drives this whole thing will be upside down. Now also I'm skipping through a lot of the assembly work and a lot of the testing and diagnostics. If you do want me to go over any of that in more detail in future videos, then please let me know. I'm skipping through a lot of it because I realise these video series do tend to drag on a bit, and I don't want to make them too boring. But if you do want to see more of any particular part of the process, then please leave a comment. But anyway, the next step is to get the power supply refitted and get the cover on, and then this entire assembly is ready to go back into the case. And then from that point it's just simple reassembly of getting the main board fitted and reconnected. Okay, the case has had time to fully cure. It's come out reasonably well. The crack in this corner is still visible, but it's closed up well. The other crack has closed up well. Unfortunately, some of the paint was chipped off there, so it shows up a bit more than the other one. But overall it's looking quite good. There are some scuffs and scratches on it, but it is an old machine, so that's to be expected. In general it's in extremely good condition. So it's time to begin reassembly, and the first thing we need to do is to fit the infill panel at the front. Now, this is a bit of an odd machine in terms of its assembly, because it's kind of assembled upside down. Everything is bolted into the top cover. Not only that, but some of the parts that are fixed, I'm not sure if it's been modified at some point or if this is just how they were made, but it's almost like the screws are missing out of it, where this is the infill panel and that fits down in here of course, but the screws don't go all the way across, they end here, which seems a bit strange. I'm not sure why they would have done that, but that's how it is, so that's how we're going to reassemble it. So just taking the correct screws, we'll get those fit. Okay, so that's those in. Now it's tempting at this point to put another screw in here and drill it through, and that would add a bit to the strength, but I'm not going to do that. This is how it was built, so I'm going to leave it as it should be. Next thing to fit is the main assembly. There's not many sub-assemblies in this. It's really just the main block with the 2 drives and the power supply, the rear panel, and then there's the main board and the keyboard, and that's it. So I'll get the main assembly and we'll get that reinstalled. Before I fit the main assembly, I need to reinstall the keyboard, mainly because there are two LEDs down here that I probably won't be able to access once I've got the main assembly in place. They're held in place with a couple of these old star clips, but the old ones, when I took them out, these are turning to dust, just crumbling to nothing. So I've got some replacements for those. So I'll just pop those into the two holes on the front panel. So just push those through the two holes. Okay, so they're in place. I can now reinstall the keyboard. Make sure I get it the right way up. Reinstall the keyboard attachment screws. Now just bear in mind when you're assembling things like this, or any piece of equipment really, that the bolts do not need to be horrendously tight. They just need snugging up enough to hold everything in place. If you try to tighten them, you'll just crack the case. So I'll just do the screws up fairly loosely at the moment, and then we'll flip it over and make sure that none of the keys are binding on the case. Okay, so I'll just quickly turn it over and we'll have a look and make sure all the keys work freely. Okay, so yep, they're all fine. So keyboard's in the right place, all the keys work as they should. I'll get it tightened down and then we can put the LEDs into their proper holders and we can fit the main assembly. Okay, so power is the top one and halt is the bottom one. Okay, that's both LEDs in place. The next thing is the main assembly. This goes in upside down, of course, and I've got to make sure that I get the two drive doors and the latches through the holes. I don't want to put too much pressure on the case, of course, because it's probably not fully cured yet. So I'll just put it in at an angle and let it tilt down, and then just make sure that the doors have gone through the front panel, which they have. Make sure we haven't trapped any wires. That looks fine. Okay, and now I can fit the securing nuts. Okay, and then there's a couple of screws front and back. I'll get those fitted, and then that's the main assembly in place. Okay, that's all the screws fitted. The next thing I want to do is adjust the disk drive position so that they run right up to the inside of the front face panel. Now I can see the edge of the face panel here, and there's a gap, if you can see it down here, between the disk drive and the panel, and also we want them pushed right up against it. So I'll slacken off the screws that hold the drives in place. I actually only tighten one, so I can slacken this off. I can now push the drives forward until they go right up against that front panel. So it's been a bit awkward. Now they are, of course, the drives are of course screwed to the top cover plate, which tends to make it a bit more awkward because that's holding them in position. So push that nice and firmly forward, tighten that screw, and do the same thing on this side, and the same thing on this side. You can kind of see how they want to spring back out of place. So I push it forward, tighten the screw, tighten the screws, and what I'll do now is flip it over and we'll have a look from the front to make sure that all the gaps are closed up and that it looks the way it should before we go any further. Okay, so it's looking good. The drives are right up against the inside of the faceplate, no gaps, they look square, nothing's fouling. The keyboard needs to come forward a little bit, it is a bit too far back, and this is the problem with this. There's so much weight in here that it's deflecting this part of the case. So what I'll do is I'll loosen the keyboard off and bring it forward 1/2 millimeter and make sure this is all freed up. I'll do that off camera. Once I've done that, then I'll get back on camera and we can get round to fitting the remaining parts. Okay, that's the keyboard adjusted. All the keys now move freely, none of them are binding. And we can now get on and fit the rear panel and the main PCB. Okay, so we'll fit the rear panel. Obviously I've got the unit on its back. First thing I need to do is reattach the ground lead. This goes onto the tab that's on one of the floppy drives. Next is to attach the mains input to the power supply. For some reason it's a 3-position socket and a 4-position plug, so I need to make sure I get it offset the right way. Okay. Right, that's it. That's it as far as this is concerned. So what I can do now is slot the panel back down. There's a groove it sits in. Make sure it's the right way up, or upside down as we're looking at it. And again, check that there are no trapped wires. Looks fine. Okay, and the final thing is the main PCB. Now, I wasn't really happy with the plastic standoffs that were in. I think I showed them earlier. They were the one was completely broken, the rest were bent, and they're really brittle and they're not going to last very long. So I've cut some M3 standoffs to length. They're attached both ends with M3 screws, but the screws don't touch in the middle, so they are still isolated. I just need to make sure that I get the board in the right way round and that the ribbon cables go underneath and end in the right place, as they did. Okay, that's the main board back in. Everything's connected up. I think it's correct. What I'll do now is flip it over and connect it to the monitor, see if it comes to life. Unfortunately, I'll have to put the base on to turn it over, because otherwise it would be resting on the bits that protrude at the bottom edge of the PCB. But with any luck, it'll work, and I won't need to take the base back off. So here it is, fully assembled. It's all up and running as far as I can test it. As it goes, this was a fairly easy restoration, just a handful of chips and a few small bits and pieces. It's come out looking quite good. There are still a few scuffs on the paintwork, but there's nothing I can do about that without completely refinishing the paintwork, which I don't like doing on vintage equipment. Everything seems to work. We'll just have a quick look at the screen so you can see how it responds to putting floppy disks in, and that will be this project finished. Okay, so this is what appears on the screen. If I press the B key, it tries to read the drive. Of course there's no disk in there, so it doesn't actually read anything. So what I'll do now is put a random floppy disk in the drive. This disk does not contain any information that this machine will recognise, but it will prove whether or not the drive is trying to actually read the disk at all. So different message this time, so it was definitely trying to read the disk. There is data coming out of the drives. I have tested that. Whether or not it's valid data I can't say, but it does appear that the system is fully functional. I've tried both drives and all the keys work, all the lights work, there are no weird noises from the drives. There's very little information available online about this. There are a few forums that discuss it. I think it would be a very interesting machine to own. As I said, this is for sale by the owner. I'm repairing it for somebody else, and I will put a link to that in the description of this video. So that's it for this project. I hope you found it interesting, and it's now on to the next one.